Well, hello everyone and welcome to today's event. This is titled Resisting the Tory Offensive, Winning an Agenda for People and Planet. Today's event is organised by the Labour Assembly Against Austerity. My name is Ben Foley, as you can see. Apologies for my lighting, but I've helped organise the Labour Assembly Autumn Conference since 2013, and this is our latest one. We've obviously decided to keep the event online this year, so thank you for registering and for joining us. The importance of today's event cannot be overstated. We're now almost 2 years since the general election and are in desperate need of a strong Labour opposition to the Conservatives. Since then, we've seen Boris Johnson's disastrous response to the COVID pandemic, from the public health failure to control the virus, the waste of the outsourced track and trace system, and the worst death rate and continued significant case numbers. And obviously news this week of the new variant, which is a concern to us all. We've seen the scandal of COVID cronyism. We've seen Conservative politicians fast-track contracts worth millions of pounds for their personal contacts. And more recently, we've seen Rishi Sunak's budget, which has simply confirmed the cost of living crisis we're all facing, with the cut to universal credit, inadequate action on the minimum wage or to deliver on public sector pay. The government's pursuing privatisation, particularly as we've seen with the health and care bill this week, and the problem of privately run public utilities is becoming increasingly apparent, with energy companies collapsing, our bills increasing, increasing evidence of private water companies dumping their sewage into rivers and to the sea. And this government is cancelling public investment, including HS2 and the Northern Powerhouse Rail. Internationally, we need urgent action on the climate change after the failure of this government's COP26. We need to defend asylum seekers who, despite the tragic deaths this week, are still being treated as people to police and to push back in the channel, and the abuse of whom often goes hand in hand with rising Islamophobia. And we need to oppose the ramping up of this new Cold War military rhetoric between the US and the West and China. All of these issues need a disciplined, organised Labour left, working hand in glove with the trade unions and with social movements to demonstrate the political leadership in Parliament with the grassroots activism on the ground. And therefore, part of our task is to challenge any abuse of the Labour Party machinery for factional ends to alienate and expel the left. If we create that pressure, it will be an alternative pole of leadership that will motivate and mobilise the left. So today's events will discuss all of these issues, and I hope you can stay all day if possible. Just to quickly run through the sessions that we have, from 1 o'clock now we've got the John McDonnell lecture, The Political Economy to Secure Socialist Change in the 21st Century. That's with John, but he'll be introduced by one of the stars of our 29 intake of MPs, Apsana Begum. Then we'll have a very short break, but at 2:15 we'll be starting with Building the Fight Back for Socialist Solutions with Richard Bergen, Diane Abbott, Helen O'Connor from the People's Assembly, Nish Rahman from Momentum, and who's a member of Labour's NEC, and Mark Sawatka, the General Secretary of the PCS Union. At 3:30, we're going to have Britain in Crisis, the urgent case for public ownership control. That's with John Trickett MP and with Kat Hobbs of We Own It. And that'll be facilitated by Sian Errington from Labour Assembly. And our last session at 4:30, we've got a great international panel. The subject of that is On the Brink of Catastrophe, Socialist Internationalism to End War, Global Injustice and Climate Chaos. And that'll be with Jeremy Corbyn, Mark Weisbrot of the Centre for Economic and Policy Research, joining us from the USA, Alicia Castro, who's political and labour movement leader from Argentina, Danielle Abono, who is a left National Assembly member from France, and the event will be chaired by another of our new MPs, Bel Ribeiro Addy from Streatham. So let's get started. Welcome everyone. Please put in the chat on Zoom or YouTube or Facebook where you're joining from today. It's always great to see how widespread our audience is, and including internationally. We'll of course, be going on asking you later in the day if you can help donate to our ongoing costs to organise these events, as we always do. But let's just move on to our first session. So I'll hand over to none other than Apsana Begum. Apsana.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute honour to be introducing John McDonnell today, someone I'm lucky enough to be able to call my colleague, my comrade and my friend. John's commitment to opening out policy discussions and engaging with people beyond the traditional political framework are some of the many things that truly make him out to me. I attended one of his town seminars in Chingford, becoming an MP, and it was impressive to see the then Shadow Chancellor sat at a round table engaging in a non-hierarchical way talking to local people about policies that affect their local area. So for those of you that don't know me, by the way, my name is Apsana and I was elected in 2019 to represent the area where I have lived all of my life in East London. I want to personally thank John for everything he has done in supporting me, not just in becoming the first hijab-wearing MP, but also as a survivor of domestic abuse facing vexatious charges, false accusations, online racist, sexist and Islamophobic abuse and threats to my safety. It's been the solidarity that's shown by people like John that has kept me going. But the role that John has played in my life goes far beyond my knowing him personally. Like many of you, I've been inspired by his lifetime of fighting for trade union rights and opposing war and oppression. And throughout John's entire political career, he has created and supported big ideas. He has been key in building campaigns now widely supported, like calling out tax avoidance and challenging bad practices in the finance sector. He's been right behind bold thinking on the Green New Deal. And what was politically unacceptable 6 years ago, the ideas of nationalizing services, centrally providing broadband, for example, is now recognized, especially in light of the pandemic, as a bold and modern idea, one that sees internet not just as a single commodity, but essential to our ever more connected lives. It's now widely accepted that Tory austerity has been the driving factor in destroying communities and creating a gig economy with low wages and ever dwindling rights. Now, we know that working class people and ethnic minority communities have disproportionately borne the brunt of the hardship and suffering throughout the pandemic. And there is now widespread admission that 11 years of austerity and cuts to public spending have left many in ruin and caused deaths. In fact, universal basic services was one of the ideas at the heart of the Labour manifesto in 2019. I saw young activists and door knockers and voters inspired by this level of ambition. And it didn't just protect the free services that we have, it wanted to extend the services we should all have access to and provide the foundation for a decent life for everybody in the 21st century. It feels important, I think, to acknowledge John for saying to people, you deserve better than what you are getting at this moment, and for refusing to give up on that optimism. I think people will revisit that manifesto in years and years to come. So yes, the past few years, we've seen so many trying to undo such progress. And we've got to recognize that the mainstream political elite are still actually, even now, struggling to find the answers to the challenges that we face. With a cabinet thwarted by scandal and a government overseeing one of the highest COVID-19 death tolls in the entire world, and the absence of an alternative vision has been very painful. But although I know that many feel demoralized and disempowered, I also have never doubted ever that there is hope, because things have been difficult before. Things, have caused and presented frustration and huge challenge, and they were overcome, and we will do so again. And actually, if we think about the clash between the radicalism of the grassroots at the Labour conference that we came out from this year and the leadership at the Labour Party conference as well was very stark. There was a clash there, and sure, there was much drama and gossip about rule changes and democracy, but the truth is that conference decisions, in fact, reaffirmed a commitment to socialist and internationalist policies, whether that was from energy to the £15 minimum wage, to Black Lives Matter, or solidarity with the Palestinian people and having a peaceful foreign policy. So reflecting and understanding that socialism is key to Labour's electoral victory and indeed success in government was something that was seen at that conference. And it is with ideas about our future, about which John is going to inspire us again with today. So without further ado, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce John McDonnell to deliver his inaugural lecture on securing socialist change.
Thanks, Apsana. Let me just say a word about Apsana. 3 or 4 years ago, she's right, I supported her selection as a Labour candidate because one of my Treasury team of advisors, Mary Partington, who was a member in her constituency, kept telling me about this amazing young Muslim woman in her CLP who was determinedly campaigning locally for radical change on a host of issues, from housing to poverty and human rights. And at times was taking on the local male establishment to do so. Supporting Apsana, I think, was one of the wisest decisions I made. She's proved in her short time in Parliament just what a staunch advocate she is for her constituency, for women, for human rights, and yes, for socialism. As a result, you can imagine she's taken a lot of flack, the sort of flack that women, especially Black or Asian women, take, and especially that socialists take. But she's always kept her chin up and never backed away from doing what is right. So I'm really proud and pleased that Apsana was asked to introduce this session, and thanks, Apsana. Let me talk about the aim of this session. Matt Wilgris, who's the sort of hidden hero who organizes these events, asked me what we should call the session. Just a word of advice, really. Never ask friends or family an open-ended question like that, because you can imagine the response I got. It was from one, John McDonnell rambling on again. Oh no, not John McDonnell rambling on again, but Matt brought us back down to earth. And to try and give the session a bit more gravitas, I suppose, suggested we call the session a lecture. It may sound a bit too much like talking down to people, which is not something we do on the left. So don't be put off. I simply want to talk and explain my view on, first of all, where I think we are politically. Then second, express some thoughts on what we're now facing. And then thirdly, I want to discuss where we need to be if we're going to advocate an economic program that can advance the cause of socialism in this coming period. Advance the cause of socialism. It's such a, I suppose it's such a bold, broad, rhetorical flourish, and it's meaningless unless we put it in some form of concrete context. So let's be clear about what we mean by socialism first. Essentially, from the origins of socialist thought and the early socialist movements, and throughout their history, at the core of socialism is the achievement of equality through democracy. In the 1980s, when on the left we were asked, what were we about? The answer is summed up in that phrase from Labour's programme, which I think came from Tony Benn's writing originally, that what we were about, what we were seeking to secure an irreversible shift in the balance of wealth and power in favour of working people. In more recent speeches and articles from 2015, we tried to explain what that would mean for the society we aim to create. And we said our aim was to create a society that was radically more democratic, and as a result of that would be radically fairer and radically more equal. It was to be based upon a thriving economy that was both, yes, economically, but as importantly, environmentally sustainable. And this is the difference between us and the Tories. It's a society where the wealth created in that economy was shared by all and shared fairly by all. That was our commitment to equality. So that was the vision of the society that we didn't just want to create. In our view, it was the nature of the society that was desperately needed. And some of you remember we consistently for a number of years, and still do to a certain extent, use the slogan, another world is possible. Well, we moved that on from another world is possible to another world is necessary. And then at times, you know, when Jeremy Corbyn became leader, actually we also said that maybe that another world is in sight now. So it's necessary, if we're to be capable of addressing the two biggest challenges of recent generations, the grotesque levels of inequality, of wealth and power in our society, and of course the existential threat of climate change, to ensure, yes, that another world does become possible. I think it's almost impossible for anyone to argue now about the overall sentiments of our aims. In fact, even Johnson and many of the Tories have sort of cynically stolen some of the rhetoric and some of our language. But where the argument and struggle come in is not about the language, but it's about the reality of how far this change goes, how radical and how fundamental this redistribution of wealth and power is, and of course, how it's to be achieved. This is exactly the right time to force open this debate, especially within the Labour Party. The Johnson regime is being exposed almost on a daily basis by its own combination of self-entitled arrogance and incompetence, exposed for what it is. It's a corrupt elite assemblage of arrogant liars, thieves and charlatans for whom politics, it's not about public service, but simply a game to be played between members of that elite. And their purpose, well, it's straightforwardly, it's lining their own pockets and dancing to the tune of finance capital in particular, who will then further reward them when they're out of office for the services they rendered to capital when they were in office. I think by his mendacious incompetence and blatant corruption, Johnson is gifting the Labour leadership with the attack lines to be employed to tear him apart. The result, I think, is now a regular narrowing of the Tory poll lead, of course, and in some polls, Labour narrowly overtaking the Tories. The problem, I believe, for Labour is that the shift in polls is largely not the result of voters shifting their vote to Labour in any large number, but more them simply withdrawing their support from the Tories. Some of you may recall that the initial response from the new Labour leadership was that Labour's poor polling performance was still the result of a carryover from the electorate's hostility to Labour from Jeremy Corbyn's leadership days. Well, then the reason, if you remember, was that COVID had meant that Keir Starmer had not been able to get out to show the world who he was. Well, it's almost exactly 2 years on from the last election. Blaming Jeremy just doesn't stand up anymore. In my view, it never did. In addition, after his extensive summer tour to meet the people, and since then the high-profile opportunities Starmer has had, the 20-point lead some claimed would be achieved certainly hasn't surfaced. In fact, in this week's YouGov poll, amazingly, Johnson had a remarkable 9-point lead over Keir Starmer. Look, I know how tough it is overhauling the Tories with the sort of media that we have in this country. But there has to be a greater, and pardon the expression, forensic analysis of what is needed to get rid of possibly the most incompetent and corrupt Prime Minister and possibly the worst governing administration in our country's history. I say before I make my main point on that, though, about what is needed, let me just say that one immediate action that is definitely necessary from Keir Starmer is the fulfillment of the promise he gave in the Labour leadership election of uniting the party. He needs to end the divisions that are being created by what many are describing as a purge and harassment of socialists within the party, which is causing, I know, for many such personal distress to people, many of whom have devoted a great deal of their lives to our party and movement. I think the first step also in uniting the party should be the restoration of the Labour whip to Jeremy Corbyn. Let me go on to my main point. The key problem the Labour leadership faces in challenging Johnson and the Tories, I think, is displayed virtually every other day in the media interviews of either Keir Starmer or shadow cabinet members. When having attacked the Tories, the Labour spokesperson is then asked by the interviewer, what would Labour do? The response, well, the response is usually a display of the sort of poor media training techniques of the new Labour days, when every slippery device was drilled into Labour spokespeople on how not to answer a question. I believe that failing to present much of an alternative means that although people are put off the Tories by the exposure of their corruption and incompetence, they're not attracted to Labour because they have little clear idea what the party currently stands for. And therefore they can see nothing to attract them to Labour. From what we pick up, it seems the present Labour tacticians' response to this is that it's too soon for policies, and the December election defeat demonstrated the weakness of having too many policies which strain credibility. They then go on to argue that eventually all will be revealed in Labour's manifesto. I think the real lesson of the December election defeat is that, well, first, of course, there was a Brexit election which divided our party and a section of its support base. But on the issue of policies, the lesson I think that has to be learned is that if you are launching new policies, no matter how popular, you need time to launch them, explain their impact on the individual and the wider community, rebut the criticisms that the media and the Tories will throw at you, and all of those attacks, and then bed them into popular discussion. For us in December 19, we were 2 years in advance of the normal electoral cycle. We were desperate to change the topic from Brexit onto the policies. But yet it's true, pushing out policy after policy does strain credibility. That's why you need time to explain them, bed them in, convince people, demonstrate what it means to their individuals and their families and their local community as well as the country. So I caution the Labour leadership that time could be running out to do this effectively. If the election is called in spring 2023 as expected, or I think an election is called even sooner, if Johnson is dumped and replaced by, well, the betting's on Sunak, but it could be Truss or Gove, or like John Major, a lesser known, safer pair of hands stepping out of the shadows. I think time is urgent for us to explain what a Labour government would mean to people. And for me, that means actually what socialism would mean to people. And I think this is where we come in as party members. It's down to us to elaborate the alternative that Labour could provide in government. And it's down to us then to create a climate of opinion, both within the Labour Party and the trade union movement, and in wider progressive movements and the wider society more generally, a climate of opinion that becomes an irresistible intellectual force for radical change. And to create that climate of opinion, to be effective in winning any argument, the key starting point has to be relevance. When we talk about economics, we have to make sure that we're talking about the lives of the people we seek to represent, our people, our class. If we're to stand any chance of securing their support, that we need to win the next election, we need to understand what people are facing and appreciate how they feel and what they think about the current state of society in their community and their own lives. You know, before COVID hit, there was sufficient social research to show that after a decade of austerity and a decade of politicians and the media telling people that there was no alternative to the taking of the austerity medicine, people had just had enough. The grinding impact of austerity with frozen wages, low pay, insecure work, poverty level benefits, the explosion of food bank dependency, ever rising homelessness, and public services in crisis, this all led to more and more people questioning the system itself. When people also witnessed, which they did, the bankers, the people who caused the economic crash, and the wealthy actually benefiting and increasing their wealth in the austerity years, it was no wonder that the hegemony of neoliberalism was beginning to be challenged. The pandemic then hit us, and it acted as a pressure test on how our society and our economy operates. Just as the pandemic had the clinical effect of exposing people's health vulnerabilities, so it also exposed many of the basic flaws of our economy and society. Flaws, the denial of resources to our public services, the failure to value, respect and reward the people whose roles we rely upon for our safety and survival, the precarious financial situation in which the vast majority of people live, the insecurity and lack of control over working lives, the lack of any power over decision-making at every level, from the firm to national government. And yes, the inability to hold leaders to account when they so patently lie to us and refuse to abide by the rules the rest of us are expected to, and also corruptly line their pockets and the pockets of their relatives and their mates. Earlier this year, I summarized a booklet of the work of a wide range of policy experts and campaigners that we undertook in the Claim the Future project. And this project examined, in the light of the experience of both austerity and the pandemic, what was needed to transform our society. We argued that COVID, and I quote, exposed the stark reality of 21st century capitalism. Not only have the weaknesses and the failings of the system been exposed, but the dominant theories upon which the economy has been managed and have all been forcibly challenged. So far from what was claimed by neoliberalism, you know, the market patently doesn't always know best. Private, good, public, bad as the dictum for the provision of public services has led to rip-off profiteering and poor and at times dangerous delivery of services we depend upon. And the wealth amassed by the rich at our expense hasn't trickled down as neoliberalism predicted. So in other words, put simply, neoliberalism is no longer credible. And we're confronted now with the potential of a paradigm shift in how people see the economy and society. Paolo Gabardi, in his recent book, The Great Recoil, describes how people have recoiled against what they experienced, both under austerity and the pandemic, as a consequence of neoliberalism in practice. Do you know, even the Tories recognise this. Hence Johnson's season on slogans like Build Back Better and Levelling Up, laced with promises of the end of austerity and commitments to increase spending and investment. But we know that neither the scale nor the content of Johnson's policies and promises address the deep-seated uncertainty and insecurity felt by people after years of austerity and the COVID pandemic. The Tories cannot address this issue. They can't address it effectively because To do so requires a shift in wealth and power from them and their class to working people that the Tories would never countenance, because it would strike at the very heart of the present economic system and political settlement. That's why, to be relevant to our people's lives and concerns, Labour's offer has to be on a scale and sufficiently radical a change to provide that redistribution of wealth and transfer of power, which will give people the certainty and the security and control of their lives that they need and want. There's also now, obviously, a rapidly growing awareness of the threats, of the causes, of the cataclysmic existential threat of climate change. In addition, people are beginning to feel the impact of the rapid development of new technology and artificial intelligence in this, the fourth industrial revolution, which is changing so much of our lives. So this all adds up to an era, an age of insecurity. It also leads to the conclusion that this is not the time either for avoiding issues or for political timidity. We've entered an era requiring radical change. We need to follow the advice of Bernie Sanders, that what he said to Joe Biden. Bernie says, in this current era, this current situation, you have to go big. Well, in an uncertain and insecure era like this, people no longer trust promises. They are looking for credible guarantees. And that's why Labour's offer has to guarantee to lay the foundations, the economic foundations, that will enable people to secure a decent and fulfilling quality of life, a home, a job, a secure livable income, a sustainable environment, access to universal basic service as of right, health and social care, education and connectivity. To achieve this, we have to reset our economy on a new set of foundational principles to create, first, an economy whose primary role is to address public need, not to promote greed or the reckless pursuit of private profit. Secondly, an economy where the distribution of rewards is based upon genuine social value, not solely market value. Third, an economy that is increasingly promoting cooperation and community, not possessive individualism. And of course, fourthly, an economy with sustainability at its heart, fully mobilized to tackle the existential threat of climate change. Two of the critical lessons that have come out of the pandemic experience is, first, that when faced with a national emergency, it's always the state at all levels that we rely upon to play the key role to meet that challenge. The second is that never again can any Tory chancellor argue that the resources cannot be found when they're needed. Throughout the years of austerity, can you remember we were told the resources could not be found to fund our public services or pay the wages or have benefit levels that so people can survive on? And yet, to deal with the pandemic, even a right-wing, staunch neoliberal advocate, Thatcherite Tory chancellor, was forced to find the resources needed. They'll still throw the argument at us, though, to say that this is just a one-off, a special crisis, and the resources had to be found. Well, our response is that it was a crisis when there were 120,000 deaths as a result of austerity. And if the existential threat of climate change is not a crisis, it's difficult to understand what is. You don't have to be a full-blown advocate of modern monetary theory to appreciate that with the political will, the resources can always be found when necessary. So our task now is to go big and to design and advocate for a program that step by step resets our whole economy, to eradicate the uncertainty and insecurity that's blighting the lives of so many of our people. And we need to show how a socialist economic program can tackle, first, more immediately people's financial insecurity. Second, provide them with the assurance that they will always be able to rely upon the support of a set of universal basic services that will guarantee them a quality of life they deserve. And finally, that through our programme of economic reform, we can address the threat of climate change by mobilising the full resources of our economy. Let me talk about financial insecurity. Our immediate aim should be to take the necessary measures to eradicate financial insecurity. And there are 4 immediate steps that could go some way to overcome this financial insecurity that people feel. The first is the introduction of a minimum income guarantee set at a level that will allow for a decent standard of living, whether a person is in work or unable to work. There's a strong argument for setting this at the level of a real living wage, accounting for housing costs and linked to the additional support for disabled people to ensure the right to independent living. Establishing an income guarantee is potentially, for me, the first step towards a universal basic income. Second, an income guarantee will be rendered ineffectual if the current record levels of personal debt are exacerbated by interest rate rises. So it's time to address the serious debt burden that causes such hardship, stress, and yes, mental health problems to so many people. One practical solution has been proposed by John and Montgomery, and that is to follow the example of how the government lifted the debt burden off the banks during the crash. The government set up what became known as the bad bank that purchased the problem debt from the banks, and because the government can borrow at low interest rates, it can cover the debt more easily. Well, I'm saying if it was good enough for a mechanism to write off the debt of the banks, it should be good enough to help lift problem debt off our people. The third step is a jobs guarantee, providing the guarantee of paid work for all workers, at least at a real living wage or a union negotiated rate, or provide them with free education or skills training. The mobilisation for £15 an hour is clearly establishing the argument for this level to be the real living wage, I believe. Then you know that the next step has to be this. It's about trade union rights guaranteed. The security provided by any job and income guarantee can be effectively permanently secured by the restoration of full trade union rights that can end exploitation and give workers a real say in the workplace. The Institute of Employment Rights, if you recall, published a detailed program, a comprehensive program of trade union reform that would provide workers in our country with the most effective employment rights in the world. Implementing this program would entitle every worker, from day one of their employment, trade union rights. It would restore the basic rights of workers to withdraw their labour, including in sympathy action, enable wages to be determined by sexual collective bargaining, end zero-hour contracts, fire and rehire would be made illegal, and of course would end the abuses of the gig economy. Security also at work also comes from being able to influence decision-making effectively. That's why worker representation on company boards is so critical to ensuring that the voice of workers is not just heard, but also plays a part in key decision-making. The proposal we put forward for inclusive ownership schemes, providing for 10% of company shares to be owned collectively by the workers in the company, is not just about securing a fairer share of rewards, but also about having a say over key decisions in that company. Let me just move on to our second challenge. This is about giving people the confidence that they will be able to rely upon access to universal basic services to enable them to live a full and fulfilled life. I believe that the pandemic has reinforced in many people's minds that there are many basic services that are so important to the quality of our lives that they should not be treated like commodities to be bought and sold, provided only to those who can pay, but instead provided universally so that everyone has access to them. You know, the vast majority of people now, especially, share our view that never again should the NHS and social care be so underfunded that they continue to be stretched to near breaking point and so ill prepared for emergencies like the COVID pandemic. So Labour, I believe, must commit to a fully funded NHS, the establishment of a national care service, and link this to the ending of the privatisation of our NHS and care services that's taking place now and on a frighteningly large scale. The same assurance must be given to people about education. There should be no retreat from decommodifying education by scrapping tuition fees and re-establishing local democratic control over school systems and the integration of private schools into the state sector. On the other services people need to enjoy for a quality of life, well, even this Tory government has been forced to effectively nationalise our railways and fund our bus routes through taxation to enable them just to survive. As a result, that presents us with an opportunity of welding them into an integrated national and locally publicly owned service, which would open the door, I believe, to a gradual process of public transport becoming a universal service provided free to all as part of the drive to environmental sustainability. Ironically, also, the pandemic has demonstrated, and Apsana referred to this, through the vital importance of internet connectivity. It's so vital to the quality of people's lives. And it made common sense now to many more people that the provision of full fibre broadband should be done on as a free universal service. You know, also, I come to this from the experiences in my constituency. Having a decent place to live is fundamental to anyone's quality of life, and especially so when we face a housing overcrowding and homelessness crisis. There are now 135,000 of our children growing up in temporary accommodation. That's why we need a housing reset programme that involves a nationally coordinated programme of mass council house building, the introduction of rent controls linked to the provision of realistic level of housing benefit, and also a policy blitz that curtails and ends landlordism by banning the purchase of homes by companies and limits the number owned by an individual. Let's now move on to the third, and I believe the most critical cause of this age of uncertainty, the existential threat of climate change. COP26 demonstrated the lack of the sense of urgency in government to implement the type of Green New Deal that Becky Long-Bailey brought forward so successfully. To seize the initiative and drive this through, well, I've become an ardent advocate of one of the ideas, which is establishing a Ministry of Public Works to coordinate a Marshall Plan scale investment program in clean physical infrastructure, in insulation, in natural capital, clean R&D, research and development. Energy efficiency measures are key to that. The development of obviously electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging networks, promotion of the cycling capacity, tree planting, and yes, the rolling out of full fibre broadband. New publicly owned industries are needed also to expand the renewable sector to supplant oil, gas and coal. Publicly funded retraining of workers for these industries is essential to ensure a just transition from the fossil fuel sector. You know, through direct state investment and a new National Investment Bank, we'd previously planned a 500 billion 10-year program of investment in our green economy, just to green overall, especially aimed at restructuring the economy to develop the opportunities of new technology and artificial intelligence to contribute to this mission. We need to look again at the speed and scale of this program, given the rapid deterioration we are witnessing in recent climate episodes. Can I raise the question as well about who owns our economy? Who owns and therefore who controls our economy has to be addressed if we're to redistribute power over decision-making to prioritise climate change. That's why at the heart of the restructuring of our economy must be the rapid development of alternative models of ownership, including cooperative ownership, municipal and local community ownership, and of course the return to national public ownership of those industries privatised by the Tories: rail, water, energy. Who owns the land and how land can be brought under democratic control and ownership is also becoming a critical issue to be addressed if we're to develop a more sustainable agricultural sector, a rewilding programme, and sustainable land use overall. In this way, with a comprehensive approach to alternative ownership, a significant proportion of our economy will be brought under democratic control to enable the restructuring of the economy away from fossil fuel dependency, but also actually to ensure that we tackle the issue of the financialized operation of the economy that dominates the operation of our economy at the present. More immediately, we also have to tackle private investment flows to divert investment fund from fossil fuels and into decarbonisation. This means changing the mandate of the Bank of England to prioritise the climate by encouraging green lending, but also setting enforceable environmental standards for private investment, with sanctions such as stock market delisting for failure to abide by those standards. I also say this: if we're to save our planet, of course, any Green New Deal has to be global. As the first industrial nation and as a colonizer, a colonial oppressor, to be frank, this country has a particular responsibility to the global south for the harm it's inflicted on its peoples. That's why, in the context of reparations for historical injustices and to work in global solidarity to confront climate change, we advocate debt relief, increased aid, the free transfer of technology, and the democratic reform of the World Bank, the IMF, and the United Nations, these global institutions that have been, well, have for too long been the source of policies that have reduced the capacity of the nations of the global south to respond to climate change. Well, finally, let me just turn to the question that's always then thrown at us. How can we afford to do all this? How can we pay for it? Well, the answer, whether we can afford to take these actions, is that when the grotesque levels of inequality in our society and the threat to our very existence from climate change, we can't afford not to. And as for how we pay for our program, we need to remind people that we live in the sixth largest economy in the world. What is holding us back is the distribution of the wealth and resources we have, and the lack of control we have also over our rigged economic system. Do you know, reforming the system is not complicated. That's what they'll try to tell you, but it's not. We simply need a reset program for our taxation and finance system to make a start. When the question of taxation is raised, the constant refrain from the right is that the rich are paying their share and more of income tax. True, they pay more income tax, but it's simply because they earn more. The rich pay 34% of their income taxes overall, whilst the poorest pay 40%. The Resolution Foundation demonstrated that when it comes to the taxation of the assets of the rich have gained dramatically over recent years, especially from spurious tax reliefs. I have a 6-point reform plan for our tax system. First, the introduction of an excess profits tax on all businesses that have made excess profits during the COVID pandemic. Second, the promotion of unitary taxation, including a new tax on multinationals that accurately reflects where their economic activity takes place and where the profits are made. Third, taxing capital gains at the same level of earnings. It's just common sense. And fourth, raising tax on the highest earners. We shouldn't shy away from a fair, progressive income tax system. And fifth, introducing land valuation taxation to provide local councils with a secure revenue stream for their local services. And sixth, launching, yes, a concerted attack on tax avoidance and money laundering, forcing full transparency on tax havens, country by country reporting, clamping down on tax avoidance enablers in the UK, and ending the corporate welfare of the tax relief system that we have, which is unproductive and indiscriminate in its provision of tax reliefs. There's one other tax initiative we need to bring forward, and my colleagues Richard Bergen and John Trickett are focusing on this, and it is the design of a wealth tax to provide an injection post-pandemic of our resources into our economy. Put together, these policies contribute to what was described as economics, the use of economic policy to achieve greater equality. If we're to harness the full resources and strength of our economy, though, we have to address, alongside tax reforms, we need to bring forward a reform agenda for our UK finance sector. The work of Prem Sikka and his long-standing team set up to tackle corporate abuse has been essential to exposing the failure of our existing regulatory structures. We need stronger regulation and greater democratization of financial regulation to ensure that this comprehensively covers areas like shadow banking, short selling, hedge funds, asset management, private equity, and the new phenomenon of greenwashing. So just to conclude, you can see that what I've tried to do is set out a number of ideas of what the first stage of a program of socialist economics would look like for an incoming Labour government. We do need to ask ourselves, though, the questions of how we would judge progress under a Labour government. As you know, at the moment, economists concentrate on gross domestic product, GDP growth. And apart from that, on the news, you'll hear reports on the performance of stocks and shares. Under our government, under a Labour government, we'll judge our progress in addressing the well-being of our people and our community. Our analytics will report on the houses built, the homeless housed, poverty reduced, wages and jobs provided, public service target delivery met, and the shift achieved from fossil fuels and the biodiversity enhanced. I think we want to measure the quality of our lives as a community by the reported increase in the songs of the birds in our gardens and open spaces, the return of badgers to our woods, and the number of hedgehogs and variety of wildlife species in our gardens and open spaces, the quality of their life that our children enjoy, their safety, their security, the way in which they're able to develop their talents, the way in which our older people are cared for, and the way in which, yes, we treat each other in a fairer, more equal society that actually only socialist policies can bring about. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much for that, John. And there's just so much to take away from that, but what a brilliant inaugural lecture. And it sets a foundation for all the lectures to come. But I particularly really enjoyed what you said about, creating that climate of opinion, that irresistible and intellectual force for change, something that was so needed in the pandemic. And, rather than just agreeing with the government, there was a slate there almost for us to reimagine a new economic world. And what also you said about colonial oppression and the legacy there, because I know a few of us have also been calling on addressing climate debt, and also addressing, if we want everyone to be on board with addressing the climate crisis and the emergency that it is, we do have to ensure that the debt of lower income countries is also addressed. Thank you so much for always listening to the perspectives and ideas in the grassroots and bringing to life all the economic ideas that put public need ahead of private greed. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to hand over now to Matt Woolgress from Labour Assembly Against Austerity. Over to you, Matt.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Apsana. I'm just doing some very quick housekeeping notes. So we've actually finished ahead of schedule, which is very strange on the left, but very good. So the next session starts at 2:15. It will start promptly at 2:15. If you are watching on Zoom webinar or on YouTube, you don't need to move. You can just stay on the same link, go and make a cup of tea or whatever, and come back, and it will streaming all 4 sessions, the next 3 sessions throughout the day, streaming that's on Zoom and YouTube. If you are watching on Twitter or Facebook, you will need to re-tune in, but it will come up straight away on the Labour Assembly feeds on both. So thank you, everyone. Also, please do remember to follow the action links that Patrick and the team are putting in the chat, and donate as well. And then we'll be popping 2:15. We'll be back on with Richard Berg and others. Thank you.